A lot of Christians don't really spend much time in the Old Testament like they should. And so today I've got a lot to cover, and there's a lot that I'm going to say that's going to be unfamiliar to many of you. So today's not the day to be looking at your phone or, scrolling social media while you listen to me or, zoning out. If you can hang with me, please do. I think you'll really get a lot out of this if you hang with me. Now, let me start by asking a question. Have you ever gotten a gift that really wasn't what you wanted? I can remember a few times that's happened to me. One of those times was when I was in junior high. And growing up, I was fortunate enough to have both sets of grandparents nearby me. And so we'd spend Christmas Eve with my mom's parents, Christmas Day with my dad's parents. One Christmas Eve, I got from my grandma on my mom's side this matching set of sweatshirts, sweatpants that were baby blue. And then the next day, I went to Grandma Berger's house, and she got me the exact same outfit, which tells me those things must have been on sale at Penny's that week or something. And I was raised right, so I said thank you with my mouth, but I said absolutely not with my head, because listen, junior high is awkward enough, right? What I didn't need is to show up to Yoakum Junior High looking like I started receiving my Social Security 20 years before, right? Right before school, I just spent the entire weekend watching cable news. It turned up to volume 11, right? And complaining about the corns on the bottom of my foot or whatever. So I don't know what happened to those clothes, but they never saw my body, right? And so maybe you've experienced this. Maybe there was a time when someone gave you a diet book for a present. Wasn't that nice? Or some exercise equipment, or maybe a DVD entitled How to Be Kind, and you're like, thanks, Aunt Frida. Now everybody knows I'm a fat, lazy jerk. So getting the wrong gift is no fun. But what I want to talk to you about today, because we're talking about, as Nathan said, spiritual disciplines, exercises that Christians have used for 2,000 years to become more like Jesus. Because just like you'd have to train to be able to play the guitar or the drums in the worship band, just like you'd have to train to be able to go out and run a 5K or a 10K or a half marathon or even a marathon, you'd have to train to do certain professions. You have to train to be like Jesus, and you train through these spiritual disciplines. Today, we're going to talk about a spiritual discipline that is a gift from God, but it's a gift we didn't want. A gift that many, many Christians never really receive, and that gift is the Sabbath. So it's found in Exodus 28 through 11, which is also known as the fourth of the 10 Commandments. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So what I'm going to do today is going to be a different structure to my message. There's not going to be 3 points as usual. So I'm going to spend a lot of time, like most of the sermon, talking about the history of the Sabbath, because it shifts. God's emphasis on the Sabbath shifts from the Old Testament to the New Testament. After the gospel comes in, the way we look at Sabbath changes, and we're going to talk about all of that, including history post-Bible. And then we're going to talk about why we still celebrate the Sabbath, why it's still an important thing for us. Then we're going to talk about how to observe it, how to make it real, how to make it useful and refreshing for your life. And then I'm going to give you a challenge. See, in this series, if you haven't caught on yet, this is 10 sermons, and all of them end with a specific challenge. I want you to try these spiritual exercises in the week ahead because my goal and my prayer is that at the end of this whole series, you'll walk away with at least one thing you've added to your spiritual repertoire, one more exercise that you're saying, I'm going to do that on a regular basis to draw closer to God. So maybe for you, it'll be this one. So let's start with the 10 Commandments. Ten Commandments, we just read the fourth one. A lot of Christians have this misunderstanding that the Ten Commandments are the heart of Christianity, that to be a good Christian is to follow those 10 rules. Now, let me say, those 10 rules are still the right thing to do. They're still what God has commanded us to do. But you can follow the 10 Commandments conspicuously and fervently and still be a terrible Christian. Because to be a believer in Jesus is to believe the gospel, to be transformed into a person who loves even his enemies, who loves their neighbors, and who loves the Lord. But what is the Ten Commandments then? What are they? What are their purpose? English. The Ten Commandments are actually part of a much, much bigger law called the Law of Moses. There are actually 613 commandments in the law of Moses. So when Moses came down from the mountain with this collection, this compendium, what it really was a constitution for a new nation. Israel had never had a country of their own. They'd always been wanderers or slaves. Now they were going into the promised land. They were going to build a new nation, and God said, this is going to be your laws. This is how you're going to structure your nation. And the whole purpose of those laws was not just to maintain law and order, but it was to make them a distinct people. You read in the Old Testament, God says it over and over again. You're not like any other people. You are a chosen people. You are a kingdom of priests. What does that mean? A priest represents God before the people. Israel was supposed to represent God before the other nations of the earth. And here's how it was supposed to work. All of those commands, all 613 commands were supposed to set Israel apart so that the other nations of the world would look at Israel and say, they're strange. They do things different than us. But look at how blessed they are. Their God blesses them. He must be a real God, unlike our stone or our wood God who doesn't do anything. Their God actually does something. Maybe we should believe in him. Israel was the hope of the world. And that's part of the Sabbath. The Sabbath, the idea behind the Sabbath is every other nation on earth, they put pedal to the metal 7 days a week. They work hard every single day. Israel only works 6 days a week, and yet they're more blessed, and yet they have more, and yet they never run out because they're faithful to their God and their God's faithful to them. So in a way, you could say that Israel was the original Chick-fil-A. So every other nation was Popeyes or McDonald's or Arby's, and they're just killing it. They're just killing themselves and burning their employees out, and they're barely making it financially. And here's Israel making beautiful chicken 6 days a week and basically printing money, okay? Because that's what Chick-fil-A does. So that was the plan, that the world would look and say, how are they doing this? And then they'd go, oh, well, their God must be real. And God was very particular. You notice in these 4 verses, he says, there's no loopholes. There's no workarounds. You can't say, okay, Lord, look at me. I'm resting on the Sabbath, but my kids are out there working so I can maintain my income. No, I'm not working, but my employees are. I'm not working, but I hitched my donkey up to that olive press so he can turn that wheel and press those olives and make that olive oil for me. I got to get ahead, Lord. No, God says nothing works on the Sabbath day. Everything takes a break so that you know that I'm the one who provides, not you. You want to know how serious this was? This wasn't optional for the Israelites. And I'll prove it to you. A few weeks after Moses came down the mountain with those tablets and the law, the people came to him and they said, hey, we found this guy and he was out in the desert. He was one of our people and he went out from his tent to gather sticks today, and today's the Sabbath. So what are we supposed to do with him? And Moses said, I don't know. This hasn't come up yet. And he talked to the Lord. And you know what God said to him? God said, put him to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And you say, wow, that's over the top. But again, what was Israel's purpose? Israel's purpose was to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, totally set apart. God knew if they start to compromise on even one of those laws, soon everything will go and they'll be just like every other nation. And actually, historically, that's what happened, which is why we needed a Messiah, which is why we needed a Savior. So that's where the Sabbath gets its start. And by the way, it wasn't just supposed to be a day of rest. Psalm 96 is a psalm specifically about how to keep the Sabbath. Do you know how Psalm 96 starts? Let me read it for you, verses 1 through 3. The psalmist writes, oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. Tell of his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. So Sabbath was supposed to be a day of rest, but also a day of worship. So we can imagine when young Jesus is growing up and he's serving as an apprentice to his dad, Joseph and Jesus would knock off work early on Friday so they could make sure they could get back home to Nazareth in time to clean themselves up and put away all their tools before the sun went down, because once the sun went down, the Sabbath began. And meanwhile, you know that Mary was in the kitchen all Friday afternoon. She was baking and preparing a great feast. My family and I, my daughter and my wife and I, Will wasn't there, unfortunately, but we had the privilege of enjoying an actual Shabbat meal in a Jewish household, thanks to our friend Aviv, and it's a beautiful thing. It's the best meal I've ever had. But they would start with a great meal on a Friday night, and then the next day they'd wake up, they'd go to synagogue, they'd hear the reading of the Torah, they'd pray with their community, they'd sing the psalms of praise to God, and they wouldn't pick up their tools and start working again until the sun went down Saturday night, right? So 24 hours of rest and worship. Now, something had changed between Moses and Jesus. Something had changed. What had changed was, especially after the exile, the rabbis within Judaism had said to themselves, our people need more guidance than is given to them in the Torah. Those 613 commands, they come straight from God. They're God's word, but our people need more guidance. They need more specificity. They don't know what it means not to work on the Sabbath. How far can you walk? Is it okay to walk a mile? Is it okay to walk a quarter mile? Is it okay to walk 100 feet? Is it okay to carry your baby on the Sabbath? If it's okay to carry your baby, can you carry two? Is that considered work? And so they came up with this library of documents called the Talmud. The Talmud is the Hebrew word for study. And the Talmud is basically taking the 613 commands of the Old Testament and turning them into case law for every conceivable situation you could need. Here's what you should do. Just as an example, remember, the Sabbath command is 4 verses. We read it, 4 verses. But the Talmud contains 24 chapters about the Sabbath alone and what is and is not considered work. I'll give you an illustration of this. Even to this day, Orthodox Jews are very meticulous about this. We stayed in the Old City on my sabbatical for 6 days. The Old City, they actually had an Airbnb in the Old City of Jerusalem. Can you believe that? And so we stayed there, which was a great experience. But one of the first things we did is we went to the market, we bought some milk and some fruit and some other things, and I went to put it in the refrigerator. When I opened the fridge, I noticed the light didn't come on. And then I noticed that someone had put a piece of duct tape over the light, over the button on the hinge of the door that makes the light come on when you open the door. So they put the duct tape over it so it wouldn't come on. And I thought, okay, now I know what's going on here. This is an Orthodox Jewish family, and the Talmud says you can't light a fire on the Sabbath. It doesn't say that in the Bible, but it says it in the traditions of the rabbis. And so when the 20th century came around, they had to discuss, okay, now that we have electricity and we can just flip a light switch and a light comes on, we don't have to light a candle, light a fire. Is that considered lighting a fire? Is it work to turn on a light switch? And many of the rabbis said yes. And so this family must have said, listen, we don't want to take a chance. We're going to cover that button so that on the Sabbath we can get a carton of milk out of our refrigerator without breaking the law of God. And you say, wow, that's just way too legalistic, right? And yet, I heard a great story from another guy in the Old City. He's a Jewish rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, runs a little shop there in the city, and he loves to talk to Christians like us, not to try to convert, but to say, let me explain Judaism to you so you understand why we are the way we are. And his story was, when my wife was pregnant, and she had all these cravings. And one day she called me at work and said, honey, I am really craving oranges. Can you stop and get us some oranges on your way home from work? And he said, instead of going and getting a little bag full of oranges, I got a big bag of oranges. And he said, why? Did I really think she was going to eat 30 oranges? No, but I wanted to go over and above what she asked because that's how much I love her. And he said, you Christians think that we Jews are just legalistic in the way that we keep the law, but really, we're just trying to show God that we love him. And I accept that and I believe that, but I also believe there's some fear involved, because I got to tell you, if I'm part of a people group that has a history in which a guy got stoned to death because he was gathering sticks on the Sabbath, I'm going to want to be meticulous too, right? So where does that leave us as believers? See, what happened is Jesus came along at a time when all those good intentions to serve God and to love God and go over and above in showing love for him and being meticulous had turned into a rigid code that actually stood in the way of people coming to know the Lord. And so here's Jesus going to church, going to synagogue on a Sabbath, and he sees somebody who's crippled or somebody who's sick. And he says, I'm not going to make that person wait until Sunday morning to get healed. I can heal them right now. They shouldn't go another minute, much less another day, without healing. And he would heal them, knowing that the rabbis were going to jump all over him like a duck on a June bug and say, you have sinned against God. And he did it anyway, as if to say, because he was showing them, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, not you. I'm not going to be judged by what you say. I'm going to be judged by the word of my Father. And I and the Father are one, so I know what the Sabbath was meant for. There's another story about Jesus and his disciples walking through some grain fields, and it's the Sabbath day, and they're hungry. Because remember, Jesus and his disciples didn't have money, they didn't have homes, and the actual Jewish law provided for that, said, if you don't have land of your own, you're hungry, go to your neighbor's grain field, take a few heads of grain, and you can eat it. That's what his disciples were doing. They're walking through the grain fields, they're picking off heads of grain, eating them just to nourish themselves as they walk. And rabbis show up and say, hey, it's the Sabbath, you can't do that, that's harvesting. And Jesus doesn't say what you and I would have said, which is, are you stinking kidding me? But instead, he says in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He says, you've got it all backwards. You've turned what my Father intended to be a gift that strengthens people, that brings them close to me, that nourishes them spiritually, emotionally, physically, and you've turned it into a punishment. You've turned it into a way to control and judge other people. Jesus was saying, listen, I made this as a gift, not as a way to beat people up. And then here comes Paul. After Jesus is gone, Paul begins to articulate for us what Jesus meant and what grace is and how the gospel really works. And the interesting thing about Paul is Paul grew up as a Pharisee. He would have been one of those guys who would have been deeply offended seeing any fellow Jew do any work on the Sabbath day. And yet, by the time he's a believer in Jesus, he's come to understand that we're now free from the law. We don't have to follow that written code. The commands of God are for our good, but they're not for trying to earn God's pleasure or his salvation. And so Paul only talks about the Sabbath twice in all of his writings. As important as it was in Judaism, it's only mentioned twice in his writings, and both times his point is, nobody gets to judge how you spend your Sabbath but God. So let me give you an example. Colossians 2, 16 through 17, Paul writes, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Now that shows two things. On a practical level, it shows, old school Baptists like me, that I was wrong to grow up judging my neighbor if I saw him mowing the yard on the Sabbath day and say, well, I'm obviously a better Christian than him. But more importantly, it shows how the meaning of Sabbath had changed from Old to New Testament, because in the Old Testament, it was a law. It was, you do this or you're out of the family. You're no longer Israel. It had become, instead, a gift, a way for people to get to God, to spend time in his presence, to be refreshed. It went from a requirement to a spiritual discipline, something you can do to grow in your faith. You should do to nourish your soul. See, another thing that happened after Paul is that the church became predominantly Gentile. Up till then, most Christians had been Jews. The original Christians were all Jewish. And so for the first one or two generations, most Christians went to synagogue on Saturday and church on Sunday. I say church. What that meant was they went to somebody's house, they broke bread, they sang psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and they listened to the preaching of the gospel. They worshiped on Saturday and Sunday. And then as Gentiles started coming to Christ and the church became more overwhelmingly Gentile, more and more, those Gentiles weren't going to synagogue because they weren't Jewish. They just went to the Sunday gathering. And then eventually the Christians looked around and said, listen, God told us to keep the Sabbath. We're going to worship on Sunday. Why don't we keep the Sabbath that day too? Since Paul says we're free to do it however the Lord leads us, let's do it on Sunday instead. And so that became the Christian Sabbath, Sunday. And that's the history of Western culture, right? In Western society, for thousands of years, you wouldn't find anything other than essential employees doing work on a Sunday. Businesses were closed. Schools, there were no activities. There was no community stuff. It was just church. That's the only thing. You heard the church bells. That was the only activity in your community. And some of us are old enough to remember when the blue laws still existed that said you can't be open on Sunday. And today it's completely different, isn't it? If you operate a retail business that's not called Chick-fil-A, it's very likely that you're open 7 days a week. And if you're an employee of one of those businesses that is closed on Sunday, and you decide to go into the office on Sunday anyway, just to get ahead, your boss is not going to shame you for breaking the Sabbath. He's going to say, now that's what I'm talking about. That's the kind of worker we need around here. You see what I'm saying? It used to be Sabbath was incentivized. You were considered a good person if you took off the Sabbath day. Now it's incentivized to not keep the Sabbath. Now you're seen as a go-getter if you don't do that, because we've lost that Christian culture, which leaves us in an interesting position as believers. How do we do this? How do we function in a society that doesn't reward us for obeying God's commands? There's also youth sports that are year-round, that are 7 days a week. There's community events. More and more school stuff is starting to appear on Sunday. So what do we do? Why, first of all, why should we still do this? Because I'm here to tell you, you don't do it because God's going to throw you out otherwise. It's not the law anymore. We're under grace. If you're not here next Sunday, I'm not going to hunt you down at your house. If I'm driving to church and I see you jogging on a Sunday morning, I'm not going to stop my car and tackle you, okay? It's not the way it works. Why should you still keep the Sabbath? 2 reasons. Number 1, we were designed for worship. That's what we were made to do. Adam and Eve, when they sinned, they lost something precious. And it wasn't just immortality, it was face-to-face contact with God. And we need that. We were made for that. And God in Isaiah 43:21 calls us the people whom I have formed for myself, that they might declare my praise. St. Augustine famously said it this way. He said, Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. That's when we know. That's when we are living life as it was meant to be lived, and we experience the joy and the fulfillment. When we have that contact with God, that worship, that time amongst his family. One more scripture on this, and I'll move on to the next point. Hebrews 10:24-25. It's not just about us and us needing to be in God's house. Hebrews says, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together. Do you see that phrase? Even in the first century, there were Christians saying, why do I need to go to church? He says, don't stop meeting together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. In this church I pastored years ago when I was in my 20s. Okay, not that many years ago, but yeah, you know what I mean. So there was a lady in there named Mrs. Sutton, and she loved to tell me the story of her late husband, who I never met. And she said, when Mr. Sutton was so old he could no longer see and could barely hear, he said to me one day, why should I go to church? I get nothing out of it. And she said, Mr. Sutton, when you show up, it encourages everybody else, because they say, if old Mr. Sutton could get up and get himself to church in his condition, then what's my excuse? And he never asked to skip church again, right? He understood, and we need to understand, we are encouraging others when we make the effort, when we show up, when we sing and participate and are part of God's worship. We were designed for that. That's the first reason we keep the Sabbath. Secondly, we were designed for rest. If you watch the news, you're aware that sometimes small planes crash. It's pretty frequent, actually. You know why they crash? The NTSB, the government agency in charge of all this, they've studied it, and they said almost every time it's not because of mechanical failure or because of the pilot's poor flying or weather. It's almost always because they run out of gas. Because these pilots, who otherwise are highly intelligent and very, very meticulous and careful, they look at their gauge and they go, okay, I'm basically on E, but I think I can push it a few more miles. And that's the mistake we make as human beings. Because I'll be honest with you, most of us are capable of working 7 days a week. We can do it. Some of you are doing that right now. You never rest. And you can do it, but it's no way to live. You're overestimating your capacity, and your body is paying the cost, and so is your soul. I love Mark Buchanan. He wrote a book, best book I've ever read on the Sabbath. It's called The Rest of God. He has this great quote. He says, Sabbath is imitating God so that we can stop trying to be God. You know who the first person to take a Sabbath was? God Almighty. He created the world in 6 days, rested on the seventh. Question, do you think God rested because he was tired? Absolutely not. God's never been tired. Why did God, for that matter, why did God take 6 days to create everything? He could have done it like that. He did it to set a pattern. He said, this is how you should live. When we take the Sabbath, when we rest, we're imitating God as a reminder that we aren't God, that we need that. And that is a useful reminder. So if that's why, what about the how? How do we observe the Sabbath? If I've already sort of broken down some of the barriers or some of the legalism that others have maybe fed you in the past, then what should we do on the Sabbath? 2 things. As long as you do these 2 things, I think you're gold. Number 1, prioritize worship. Make sure you're in God's house. All my life I've heard preachers say, going to church doesn't make you a Christian. Sitting in a church pew doesn't make you a Christian any more than sitting in a garage makes you a Buick. I believe that. That's true. But I think we've oversold that point, and we've made it sound like church is sort of optional. And I'll tell you, it's not. There's nothing in the scriptures that says anything about a Lone Ranger Christianity where you just never get in contact with others. In fact, if you really want to follow Jesus, you're going to be in God's house. Your attitude should be what we read about in Psalm 84. It writes, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of the wicked. You should yearn to be in God's house. Sunday should be your favorite day of the year. You should be excited to get up and go to church. And if you're like, well, Jeff, what if I'm not? What if I have to drag myself here? What if this is a chore for me? What if I'm fighting just to stay awake every Sunday morning while you talk on and on and on? What do I do? Well, let me ask you a question. What would you do if starting tomorrow food didn't taste good anymore? Would you stop eating? If you no longer enjoyed the process of eating, would you stop putting food into your body? No, of course not, because you know that if you stop eating, you're going to die. You can live about 4 weeks or so, and then starvation starts, and pretty soon you're a carcass. So you keep eating, even if it doesn't taste good, even if you don't enjoy it. But you missed the fact that food used to taste good. So you're going to go to the doctor. You're going to say, Doc, what's wrong with me? Take whatever blood samples you need, find out what I need to do because I want to enjoy eating again. And I'm here to tell you, if you're a believer in Jesus and you don't enjoy worship, that's a sign that something's wrong. Talk to the Lord about it and say, Lord, what do I need to do? What's wrong in me? Is there sin I need to confess? Is there something I need to do to prepare my heart for Sunday mornings? Do I need to sit down with the pastor or the worship leader and just say, give me some hints on how I can get more out of it? Listen, this is how strongly I feel about this, and you're not going to believe I'm going to say this, but if it means that you feel like you need to join another church because you get more out of it, then you have my endorsement. I don't want you to leave. Believe me, there's not a person in this room who I'm like, Lord, please call them to some other church. I want you to stay. I'd love for you to work it out here, but I'd rather you be somewhere where you're actually worshiping the Lord, because that's what you need. Prioritize worship. And then some others may say, well, yeah, but we're so busy. What about my family where my daughter plays in the soccer team and my son plays in this baseball team, and we're just never home more than maybe one Sunday in a couple of months? What are we supposed to do? Listen, you're going to be glad to hear that you don't have to answer to me for how you raise your kids. You answer to God. So I'm not going to tell you what I would do if I were you, but I am going to tell you, when you stand before the Lord as a mom, as a dad, what he's going to want to know is not just did you put a roof over their heads and did you feed them and clothe them, but did you live out your faith before them? Did you did you pass your faith along to them as best you knew how? Did you pastor your children? You can't decide whether they follow Jesus or not. They make that decision themselves. But did you do all that you could to guide them to that decision? Just like I try to do the same thing for you as my flock. Did you do that? Now, I've talked to Christian families that have outstanding young Christian men and women that played year-round baseball or year-round soccer, and I know it's possible, and I know that good can come out of that. So I'm not judging you if you make that choice. What I would say is this. Your kids pay attention not just to what you say, but what you do. And if the decisions you make communicate to your child, school and baseball practice are non-negotiable, church is optional, then they're going to grow up probably to be Christmas and Easter attenders at best. And your grandkids won't know Jesus at all. Again, not saying you can't ever be gone on Sunday. I'm asking if your kids are involved in something that keeps you out of church, ask yourself the question, how then am I teaching them to prioritize worship? What do I need to do to make both of those things happen? Because again, your kid, I don't care if he's the next Nolan Ryan. Look him up, millennials. There's going to come a day when he's not playing baseball anymore. But there's never going to come a day when he doesn't need Christ. Okay, so prioritize worship. Number 2, refresh your body, your mind, and your soul. There are older Christians that I know who have told me, I have to admit, I hated Sundays when I was growing up because I love Jesus, I love going to church, but after church, my parents wouldn't let me play, wouldn't let me watch TV, wouldn't let me read comic books, wouldn't let me go outside. I was supposed to just sit there and be quiet because that's what they thought you were supposed to do on Sunday. With all due respect to those parents who were doing the best they could with what they knew, I think that's not what God intended for the Sabbath. I think he intended it to be a day when we're fully refreshed, when we lay aside the tools of our labor, the things that we do to maintain, to keep the world spinning, right? And just say, Lord, I trust you to keep the world spinning for a day without me. I'm going to rest from all of that, and I'm going to do what refreshes my soul. For some of you, if you're honest, the holiest, most restful thing you could do after this service is go home and take a nap. And you can tell your wife I said so, okay? Now, that's not me. I'm not a napper. If I'm napping, it means I'm really, really exhausted. But there are other ways I refresh my soul. It may be reading a good book. It may be watching a ball game with one of my kids. It may be us doing something together as a family. John Mark Comer has this habit that he started. He's the guy I'm quoting a lot this year, but they do the Jewish style Sabbath. Since he's a pastor and Sunday's not a day of rest for him, they start on Friday with a big meal. Everybody puts their cell phones in a drawer and they keep them there until Saturday at sundown. And then the next day they wake up Saturday and they all have their quiet times. And then the rest of the day is free time mixed with family time. They have a movie night or they have a game night or they go for a walk or they go for a picnic, but it's just a day of rest for their family, and it's been a beautiful thing. So here's my challenge for you. My challenge for you is this week, try that. Not necessarily his method, but plan how you're going to spend next Sunday. You may never have done this before. You may have just thought, well, Sunday we wake up and we go to church and then the rest of the day is ours. But I'm telling you, this next Sunday, make a plan. Pray about it from now until next Sunday. Go online and search ways to observe the Sabbath. because there are a lot of creative things that families are doing to come together and celebrate the Sabbath. Decide what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, how you're going to plan so that Sunday morning when you wake up, it's not a stressful time getting to First Baptist downtown Conroe. Plan it out and make it the best Sabbath that you and your family have ever had. That's my challenge to you. Now, one more thing. How good is God? How good is God that he would look at his people and say, you guys need a break. I want you to do something that's not necessary for your survival, but it's necessary for your flourishing. I want you to be happy. I want you to be rested. I'm giving you this day. That's how good God is, but it gets even better than that. There's one more passage about the Sabbath I want to read to you. It's Hebrews 4, 9 through 10. It says, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. What does that mean? The Sabbath rest he's talking about is not Sundays. The Sabbath rest he's talking about is the fact that when you come to Jesus, your work is done. I don't mean the work you do for a living. I don't mean the work you do to keep your house clean. I mean the work you used to do to try to make yourself feel significant. The work you used to do to try to earn your way into heaven when this life is done. All that's done. You are in a perpetual Sabbath rest from then on. Why? Because Jesus came and did the work for you. Because Jesus came and did all those righteous things that you should have done, and then died the death that you and I deserve to die. And therefore, all that good stuff came and redounded to our credit, to our glory, and therefore, we stand in a perpetual Sabbath rest, and we never have to worry that God's going to throw us out or get tired of us or not let us in because we rest from our works. And how good is God that he would do that for us? Why wouldn't we then give him his day?